She was the woman every American man in the 1950s wanted to bring home to his mother. Blonde, wholesome, endlessly cheerful, the kind of face that made an entire country believe in happy endings again after a war that had taken so much from so many. But the real story of Doris Day is almost the exact opposite of the image she sold on screen. Behind that smile was a teenager who nearly lost her legs before she ever became famous. A young wife who was beaten while carrying her only child, and a woman whose own husband quietly drained a fortune worth millions while she had no idea any of it was happening. Today we're looking at why men loved Doris Day. And by the end of this, you will understand that the woman audiences adored was, in almost every way that mattered, someone the public never actually got to meet. Stick around, because the gap between what America saw on screen and what Doris Day actually lived through is one of the most jarring in the history of Hollywood. Let's start with the woman the world thought it knew. She was born Doris Marianne Kappelhoff on April 3, 1922, in the Cincinnati suburb of Evanston, Ohio, to a German immigrant family. Her father, William Kappelhoff, worked as a church organist and choir director, a quiet and rigid man by most accounts. For most of her adult life, Doris herself believed and publicly stated she had been born in 1924, and it wasn't until Associated Press researchers tracked down her actual birth certificate around her 95th birthday that the real date was confirmed. Her parents divorced when she was around 10 years old after her father's infidelity came to light, and the household that remained was run almost entirely by her mother, Alma, who quickly recognized that her daughter had a gift for dance. By her mid-teens, Doris and her partner Jerry Doherty had become locally celebrated dancers, good enough to win competitions and be noticed by professional touring companies out of Hollywood. Everything appeared to be lining up. And then in one night, it wasn't. We'll get to exactly what happened in a moment, because it's one of the most consequential accidents in the history of American entertainment. But first, it's worth understanding just how enormous Doris Day's career eventually became, because the scale of what she built makes what she was hiding even harder to believe. After her recovery, she pivoted from dance to singing, and the shift turned out to be one of the most fortunate redirections in show business history. She joined bandleader Les Brown's orchestra, and by 1945 had two songs sitting near the top of the national charts: Sentimental Journey and My Dreams Are Getting Better All the Time. She went solo not long after, and across a recording career that ran from the late 1940s into the late 1960s, released more than 600 songs. Her film career took off in 1948 with Romance on the High Seas, and from there she moved fluidly between genres in a way few stars of her era managed. She played the title role in Calamity Jane in 1953. She starred opposite James Stewart in Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1956, a film that gave the world her signature song, Que Sera. She formed one of the most beloved on-screen pairings of the era with Rock Hudson, appearing together in 3 romantic comedies, including Pillow Talk in 1959, which earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The two remained genuinely close friends off-screen for the rest of their lives, and Doris was one of the first public figures to speak out in support of Hudson when he became one of the earliest Hollywood stars to disclose an AIDS diagnosis in the mid-1980s, at a time when public sympathy for AIDS patients was in desperately short supply. She shared screen time with Clark Gable, Cary Grant, James Cagney, and Frank Sinatra. By any measure, she was one of the defining stars of an entire era of American cinema. When she stepped away from film in 1968, at what most industry observers considered the peak of her drawing power, she moved into television with The Doris Day Show, which ran for 5 seasons through 1973. The honors kept arriving for decades afterward: a Golden Globe, the Cecil B. DeMille Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1989, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2004, a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008, a Career Achievement Honor from the Los Angeles Film Critics Association in 2011. The same year she released a new studio album that reached the UK top 10 in her late 80s. By some measures, she remains one of only a handful of recording artists to have topped the American box office in 4 separate years. That's the version of Doris Day the world got to see. Now here's the version she lived through. It started on the night before her life was supposed to change forever. On October 13, 1937, 15-year-old Doris Kappelhoff had every reason to believe her future was set. She and her dance partner Jerry Doherty had just signed a contract with an organization that placed dancers in Hollywood productions, and friends had gathered that evening to celebrate the two teenagers on the verge of a new life on the West Coast. The plan was simple: finish out their local engagements, then head west and begin the career they had spent nearly 6 years training for together. The drive home from that celebration changed everything. Doris was riding with Jerry and two friends when their car was struck by a train at a railroad crossing in nearby Hamilton, Ohio. The intersection had no gates and no warning lights at the time, and the collision was severe. Doris's right leg was crushed in what doctors would later describe as a double compound fracture. She was pulled from the wreckage in agony, reportedly crying out that her leg was broken as she was loaded into the ambulance, desperate for her mother to be told what had happened. The recovery was brutal and much longer than anyone anticipated, stretching over roughly a year, complicated at one point by a fall that re-injured the same leg. The dancing career that had defined her entire adolescence was finished before it had really begun. For a girl who had spent nearly 6 years training toward a single goal, lying in a hospital bed watching that future dissolve was devastating. She later wrote that returning to school on crutches left her feeling pitied by classmates, a sensation she said she despised more than almost anything else. But her mother refused to let the recovery become the end of the story. With dance no longer an option, Alma steered her daughter toward voice lessons instead, enrolling her with a local singing teacher, and pushing her to keep working even while she was confined to a chair. Doris spent the long months of recovery listening to the radio, singing along, and slowly discovering that she had a voice worth training. Within roughly 2 years of the crash that had ended her dancing ambitions, a local band leader named Barney Rapp heard her sing, chose her over more than 200 other performers who had auditioned, and gave her a regular paying gig at his newly opened Cincinnati nightclub. It was Rapp who suggested she drop her German surname, which he considered too difficult for marquees, and take a stage name instead. He landed on Day, inspired by a song she performed regularly, called Day After Day. The accident that could have ended her story before it started, instead redirected her into the one that actually made her famous. If you're enjoying this and haven't subscribed to old tapes yet, now's a good time. We tell the real stories behind the Golden Age legends, the parts that never made it into the studio press releases. Now here's where the gap between image and reality starts to widen. Doris Day's entire screen identity was built around a very specific idea: the cheerful, wholesome, endlessly optimistic girl next door, who always got her man and always landed on her feet. It was an image the studios cultivated with enormous precision, because in the years after World War II, American audiences were hungry for exactly that kind of reassurance. Doris fit the role perfectly, and the studios leaned into it hard, casting her again and again in light romantic comedies that reinforced the same wholesome persona film after film. The problem was that the persona had almost nothing to do with the woman living inside it. When Doris tried to push toward more serious, dramatic material as her career matured, the industry resisted. It was more profitable, and frankly easier to keep selling audiences the version of her they already loved. So she kept playing variations of the same character while her actual life, marked by abuse, financial betrayal, and a private sense of isolation that never really left her, stayed carefully hidden from public view. The executives around her understood exactly how far the gap between the two had grown. They simply had no interest in letting the public see it. Because what was actually happening behind that image was something audiences of the era would have found very hard to reconcile with the woman smiling at them. From movie screens, her first marriage set the tone early. In 1941, at 19 she married a trombonist named Al Jordan, a musician she had met while singing with his band. According to her own later account, his temper surfaced almost immediately, within roughly a day of the wedding itself. The relationship deteriorated quickly from there. According to multiple later accounts, Jordan was intensely jealous and became physically violent early and often. When Doris became pregnant with their son and made clear she intended to keep the baby rather than end the pregnancy as he wanted, the situation reportedly grew worse rather than better, and she has described being assaulted by him during that pregnancy. She gave birth to their son, Terrence, in 1942 and carried the child while enduring what she would later describe as an atmosphere of fear inside her own home. The marriage lasted only a couple of years before she found the strength to leave, taking her infant son with her and beginning a long and difficult process of rebuilding on her own terms. That kind of trauma doesn't simply disappear once someone walks out the door. Doris carried the effects of that first marriage for years, and by her own account, it shaped how cautiously she approached love and trust for the rest of her life. A brief second marriage to saxophonist George Weidler in 1947 ended without violence, but also without staying power, reportedly because Weidler grew uneasy watching her career eclipse his own. By her own account, he ended things through a letter rather than a conversation. Then came the marriage that would define both the height of her career and the depth of her financial betrayal. In 1951, Doris married Martin Melcher, a man who quickly became not just her husband, but her agent and the manager of virtually every business decision in her professional life. For years, it appeared to be an ideal arrangement. Doris poured herself into acting, singing, and recording, trusting her husband entirely to handle the money and the contracts while she focused on the work in front of the camera. It felt, by all outward appearances, like a genuine partnership. What Doris didn't know was that Melcher had placed nearly all of her finances in the hands of a Beverly Hills attorney named Jerome Rosenthal, a man Melcher trusted almost blindly for close to 2 decades. Melcher and Rosenthal kept offices next to one another and consulted constantly, sometimes daily, over the better part of 18 years. Rosenthal steered Doris's earnings, reportedly worth around $20 million at the peak of her career, into a string of troubled ventures: speculative land bank bonds, failing hotel investments, shaky oil and gas partnerships, arrangements that later court findings described as riddled with conflicts of interest and undisclosed kickbacks. Doris herself later said she trusted Rosenthal because her husband trusted him completely, and she had no reason at the time to question either man. Everything came apart in 1968, when Martin Melcher died suddenly. It was only after his death that Doris and her son Terry began digging through the finances and discovered the true scale of what had happened. Rather than the fortune she believed she had built across 2 decades of relentless work, she found herself facing several $100,000 in tax debt and a financial structure that had been quietly hollowed out for years without her knowledge. Her own record contracts, it turned out, had been borrowed against for songs she hadn't even recorded yet, with the money already spent by the time she learned of the arrangement. To make matters worse, she also learned that Melcher had committed her, without her knowledge or consent, to star in a new television series, The Doris Day Show, apparently as a way of generating income to help cover the financial hole neither of them had told her about, with production scheduled to begin only weeks after she found out about it. Doris pursued the matter through the courts, and the case against Rosenthal became one of the longest-running pieces of civil litigation in California history, dragging on for years through a 99-day trial and multiple appeals. In 1974, a judge awarded her more than $22 million in damages for fraud and malpractice, later increased on appeal to over $26 million once punitive damages were included. The judge overseeing the case described the entire arrangement as riddled with conflicts of interest, from beginning to end. Her son later said publicly that she never recovered anywhere close to the full amount, receiving only a partial payment years later through an insurance settlement. Rosenthal himself spent nearly 2 more decades fighting disbarment proceedings before finally losing his law license in 1987. The betrayal cost Doris more than money. It cost her the belief that trusting someone completely was ever truly safe. She rebuilt anyway. She stepped into the Doris Day Show, initially a commitment she hadn't asked for, and used it to reestablish both her career and her finances over the following 5 seasons. In time, she came to reflect that the entire ordeal had taught her a lesson she wished she had never needed to learn: that love and trust, however genuine, still require oversight, because blind faith in another person's hands can quietly cost you everything. And underneath all of it, something else was eating at her that had nothing to do with money at all. For all her fame, for all the fan letters and awards and decades of adoration from audiences around the world, Doris Day was, by many accounts, a deeply lonely woman. The very fame that made millions of people feel like they knew her intimately made it almost impossible for her to form the kind of real, unguarded friendships she actually wanted. Every gesture, every relationship, every conversation carried the weight of public scrutiny. She was watched constantly, and being watched constantly is not the same thing as being known. Her romantic history compounded that isolation. The violence of her first marriage and the financial betrayal of her third left her, according to those close to her, hesitant to fully open up to anyone again. A fourth marriage, to restaurateur Barry Comden in 1976, ended in divorce a few years later, reportedly because Comden felt she cared more about the strays and animals she was constantly rescuing than she did about him. She wanted genuine companionship. She said as much herself in later interviews, describing a persistent sense of something missing even at the height of her success. She had the accolades. She had the fan mail. What she said she didn't have, for long stretches of her life, was someone real to lean on. Much of that yearning found its way into her music. Que Sera, Sera in particular, became something bigger than a hit song for her, a kind of quiet meditation on accepting a future you cannot control. delivered by a woman who had lived through far more uncertainty than her cheerful screen image ever let on. And then, later in her life, came a loss that hit harder than any of it, along with a strange and unsettling footnote to that loss that very few people ever connect back to her. Her only son, Terry, born during the chaos of her first marriage in 1942, grew up largely shielded from the turbulence Doris had endured, and went on to build a career of his own as a respected record producer, working with major names in the music industry including the Byrds. Doris was fiercely proud of what he accomplished, especially given how difficult his earliest years had been. In the late 1960s, Terry was living at a rented house on Cielo Drive in Beverly Hills, a property Doris herself owned. When he moved out in 1969, the house passed into the hands of its next tenants, director Roman Polanski, and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, who would be murdered there later that same year in one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Terry Melcher was drawn into the periphery of that investigation because of his prior connection to the property and to Charles Manson, whom he had briefly auditioned as a musician before deciding not to pursue a record deal with him. It remains one of the strangest and least known footnotes tied to Doris Day's family, a brush with one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history that had nothing to do with her own career at all. Terry survived that unsettling chapter and continued working in music for decades afterward. But in 2004, he was diagnosed with skin cancer. Doris watched her son fight the illness for months, and in November of that year, he passed away at the age of 62. For a woman who had already survived an abusive marriage, a devastating financial betrayal, and decades of quiet isolation behind a very public smile, the loss of her son was, by every account, the most painful chapter of her entire life. In the years that followed, Doris withdrew almost entirely from public life, settling permanently in Carmel, California, where she had already spent years building the Doris Day Animal Foundation, an organization she started in the late 1970s that continued to grow into one of the most significant animal welfare charities associated with any Hollywood figure. She rarely gave interviews and almost never appeared in public, channeling what remained of her energy into rescuing and caring for animals, as though redirecting a lifetime of grief into something that could still do good in the world. She died in Carmel on May 13, 2019 at the age of 97, having outlived nearly every one of her contemporaries from the golden age of Hollywood. So here's the real answer to why men loved Doris Day. They loved a performance, a carefully constructed, brilliantly executed performance of a woman who was cheerful, safe, and endlessly optimistic, built by studio executives who understood exactly what post-war America wanted to see. What almost none of them ever got to know was the actual woman behind it, a teenager who rebuilt her entire future after a train nearly took her legs. A young wife who survived violence most people never suspected, a star who was financially betrayed by the men she trusted most, and a mother who carried grief that never really left her, all while smiling for cameras that had no idea what they were actually looking at. So here's what I want to know from you. Of everything Doris Day went through behind that smile, what surprises you the most? The accident that nearly ended her career before it started, the abuse she survived in silence, or the fortune that vanished without her ever knowing? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.